So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jen McKenzie, and I am the owner of Milestone College Prep. I have been doing test prep since about 2006. And while I do not do as much test prep any longer, as I'm usually advising students on other aspects of the college process, I still stay really connected to what's going on in the test prep arena. And so I want to try and answer some questions, maybe demystify some of this for you tonight, and hopefully provide you with some information that will be helpful in guiding your own children through this process. As we get started, the first thing we're going to do is we've got a few questions. We just want to take a couple polls so I can get a better sense of who's on the call and what's going on with your children. So if you can answer the questions right now as they are launched, that would be great. And then we'll share the results. Looks like the majority of you either have students who are probably testing now or will be testing next year. So it looks like got a bunch of kids taking SAT, probably because that is the next test coming up in March. Okay, thank you for taking the time to answer those questions. All right, so we're going to start. I'd like you to, and I invite you to type in questions in the chat box as we go. We will stop and answer them. We will try and get to all of them as we can. But I'm going to go ahead and open it up with probably the most common question that we get. We answer it many, many times a day, and that is, what is the difference between SAT and ACT? So there are quite a few differences. I've made a couple of PowerPoint slides that we're going to go ahead and put up on the screen, and I'll talk you through those a little bit. The first thing that I think is important to note is that both of the tests are nationally recognized standardized tests, and they are accepted by all colleges and universities. All universities do not have a preference for SAT or ACT. So it really is about finding the test that is best suited to your child's particular abilities. Both SAT and ACT give the test sections in a predetermined order, and each section only appears once. So this is very different than what we experienced, parents, when we took the SAT. If you remember, everybody's test booklet was different. Some people had math first, some had reading first. It's no longer that way. Every test is given in a predetermined order. Now, both tests use right-only scoring, and what that means is there is no penalty for wrong answers. This used to really be a big issue on the SAT, as that required a lot of strategy, knowing when to guess, and oftentimes that really impacted students' scores when they struggled with that piece of the strategy. And then both tests have an optional essay. Overall, the major differences between the two tests are the SAT is slightly longer in terms of total time, but the ACT has more questions, thus less time per question. And we're going to talk about the timing a little bit later, because that is one of the key differences and sometimes one of the key issues for students who are taking the ACT. So when we move on, we're going to talk about, so each section is a little bit different. The ACT has English, math, reading, and science. There is no science section on the SAT. There's just a science passage. But I really want to focus on the math, because the math sections of the test is the section that's completely the most different. And it's oftentimes the section that we really use to determine which test is going to be the better test for a student. So on the SAT, math is 50% of the total score. On the ACT, math is only 25% of the total score. So what this means, and we're going to show you a little visual here in just a minute so you can really see how this works. If you have a student who is a weaker math student, even though the ACT math, as we will talk about, is probably slightly more difficult than the SAT math, it has, the SAT math has a greater impact and a greater potential negative impact on the overall score. So if you have a weaker math student who really struggles, almost always, unless timing is a major issue, and they don't get an extra time accommodations, we're almost always going to recommend that they start with the ACT. Now, in terms of content, while both tests have a large focus on algebra, ACT has a much larger focus on geometry and trigonometry than the SAT. Almost 3 times as many geometry questions on the ACT than the SAT. The SAT also tests some higher level concepts. Matrices are on the ACT. There's a little bit of pre-calc that you're not going to find on the SAT. But generally speaking, the questions are asked in a maybe in a little bit more straightforward manner on the ACT. The SAT has a no calculator section and the ACT does not. So if you have a child who's very good at mental math, then that ACT is going to be fine for them. If you have a child who can't add in their head and really struggles with that, that could be kind of a game changer on the SAT. Also, the SAT provides some of the formulas. The ACT provides no formulas. So if you have a child who is not willing to do any of the work in memorizing formulas, they may prefer the SAT format. So there's probably pros and cons for all of your students, but I think the big one to keep in mind is the percentage of the overall score that can be impacted by the math. Okay, so we're going to go ahead now to actually the next slide, which shows you this breakdown. So these numbers are obviously pretty extreme, so we can make the point. But if you look at the ACT, you have a student scoring in the 90 plus percentile in 3 of the sections and only the 28th percentile in math. And their overall score is still close to the 90th percentile. If you look at those same percentiles on the SAT, you can see how much different that overall score is. So that is really something to keep in mind. As long as we're talking about the math, one of the other questions we get, and I think it's a good segue into one of the next questions that we get, which is, when should my student start testing? And that also really has to do with where they are in terms of their math skills. So if you have a child who is going into calculus as a junior, who is way ahead in math, they are going to want to start testing early. Perhaps as early as the end of sophomore year, but definitely either summer or the very beginning of junior year, because once they start getting into those really difficult math concepts, they're going to forget a lot of that basic pre-algebra and algebra that's tested on both the SAT and the ACT. If you have a child who is going into Algebra 2 as a junior, they are going to want to get as much Algebra 2 under their belt as possible before they start testing. So that's a student who's going to test much, much later into the spring. Probably first test potentially March, April, even into the summer following their junior year, and perhaps even into the fall of senior year. And I always tell people that students can really test through October, and it does not impact the application timelines. They can still be submitting applications. Schools will still be accepting scores. And if you have a student who's going into trig or pre-calc, we'd like them to have a little bit of trig and pre-calc under their belt if possible, particularly if they're going to be taking the ACT. They might start in the middle of their junior year. If they're taking the SAT, perhaps a little bit sooner. We also look at, in addition to the math, what extracurricular activities are going to come into play. If you have an athlete who has a really, really difficult practice schedule at a particular time of the year, we're going to want to plan and think about their testing timeline in relation to that, as well as summer plans. I have a lot of students who go away all summer and they're not going to think about prepping until they get back. And then we don't always want to just start them prepping right when they're starting their junior year and taking, a million APs. So these are all factors to consider, but generally speaking, you can use that math class as a guideline for when you want to start thinking about their testing. And you would map out prep, likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 months before their first test, depending on where their skill level is. And that can be assessed through the PSAT scores that they have. It can be assessed through baselines for both SAT and ACT, which we administer here in the office. So there's a couple different ways to kind of see where your child's abilities are and how much prep we think they should have before they start testing. Okay, so I want to open it up. I don't want to monopolize all of the questions here. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? I've got a few more we can talk about. Okay, so I'm going to go on and talk about one of the other questions that I get a lot. What is considered a good score? And I think that this is an important question to address, not just from sort of a numerical perspective, but also in terms of the messaging that we start to send to our children. So good is very subjective, and that really depends on a couple of different factors. One is your child's ability, and 2 is your child's goals. So obviously, you know, if we're dealing with a salutatorian who has aspirations to go to an Ivy League school, you know, a 22 ACT or an 1100 SAT is probably not going to be an adequate score for them. And I deliberately did not use the word good there. But if you have a child who is an average student who starts with a baseline of an 18 and aspires to get to UNF and scores a 23 or 24, that is an excellent score for that student, and they've made really great progress. So I hesitate at the onset of the conversation about test prep and starting test prep to try and, you know, label any particular score as good, as there are multiple factors to take into consideration. And I would caution you as parents to just start the dialogue with, listen, I want to see you put in your best effort. I want to see you work hard to achieve your maximum potential. And then obviously we'll look at schools that are going to be commensurate with grades, test scores, and we go from there. But I think that's an important message to keep in mind when you're talking about scores with your child. One of the other things that I want to address, because it comes up often, is what are the scores that my student needs to earn for Bright Future Scholarship, and what are the scores that are going to make my student competitive for some of the state universities. So, as I'm sure most of you know, the state of Florida offers Bright Futures scholarships for students who are high achieving. There are 2 levels of Bright Future Scholarship. There's the medallion level, which currently pays 75% of tuition, which is about $7,000 a year. In order to achieve 75%, students need to score either an 1170 on the SAT or a 26 ACT. The 100% Bright Futures, which currently pays 100% of tuition for Florida public universities, is 29 ACT or a 1290. Now, an important note for both those SAT and ACT scores is that they are super scored. So I don't know if everybody knows what the term super scoring means, but it is something you will hear a lot in the coming years. So if your student takes multiple SATs or multiple ACTs, Bright Futures and actually many of the colleges in Florida will allow them to super score, which means they will take their best English, best math, best reading, best science from different scores, put them together to create a super score composite. Bright Futures and every school within the state of Florida will super score the SAT, but most of them super score the ACT. If a school does not super score, like UF does not super score the ACT, they are looking for the highest daily composite, and that is the single composite score from one sitting of the test. So for Bright Futures, they can super score either, get that 75% or 100%. Now, I'm going to talk about the scores for 3 of the schools in Florida, UF, FSU, and UCF, as these right now have the highest requirements. These scores are based, these numbers are based on last year's 2018 numbers. We don't have all the numbers yet for 2019. So for UF, the middle 50% range right now for fall admission, which is the most competitive, is 1,300 to 1,450, or an ACT range of 29 to 33. Now, as I mentioned, UF does not superscore the ACT, so that would be a single day testing, a single daily composite for ACT. For FSU, which does superscore both tests, your middle 50% range is 1,290 to 1,400, and an ACT of 28 to 32. For UCF, right now, that range is a 1,280 to a 1,370, and a 26 to a 30. And UCF also does not superscore the ACT. Now, when I say these are for fall admission, fall is always the most competitive term for each of the state universities. Those requirements are slightly lower for summer admission, and some of the universities actually do spring admission as well, and the numbers would be slightly lower for those as well. Okay, so I'm going to take a question here. The question is, does UF and FSU compensate for a student with a higher GPA and lower test scores and for admittance as well as the other way around? So that's a great question. There's no hard and fast rule. So these ranges that I gave you are middle 50% numbers. That means that 25% are below that middle 50%, 25% higher. So if you have a student who is much higher, at the high end of that middle 50% for GPA requirements, and maybe is slightly below the middle 50% for test score requirements, they're probably still going to be competitive for that university. If they're below the middle 50% in both GPA and test score requirements, probably not. But yes, they do take some of that into consideration. Believe it or not, probably less so for a higher test score and a lower GPA, because the most important factor for admission into college is GPA. That tells universities how a student performs over the long haul, what they're able to do, how they handle the workload on a daily basis. Whereas test score is a little bit more of a snapshot. So GPA requirements that's your number one focus for students always. Rigor actually tends to be more important for the state universities even than test scores. And test scores is sort of the third, requirement that they're looking at. So hopefully that answers your question. One of the other questions I have is, what type of gains should a student expect after taking the ACT or SAT more than once? So this really depends on the level of effort that your student is putting in, because it's not just about showing up for an occasional, tutoring session. It's really important to do timed practice and get that repetition in. So for students who are actually showing up for tutoring, doing homework, and doing consistent practice, timed practice on the ACT, they can often expect somewhere between 2 and 4 points in a game. For SAT, somewhere between 50 and 100 points if they are doing consistent practice. And I can't emphasize that enough, particularly on ACT, because the timing is really tricky. So students who are religious about doing their homework and perform really well when they're doing isolated problems with tutors are often really surprised when their ACT score looks very different after they've taken it under the time constraints. So I would say 2 to 4 points for ACT, 50 to 100 points for SAT, sometimes as much as 150, but it has to come with really consistent practice. Okay, moving on to another question that was actually sent to us earlier, and that was about students with learning differences and how that impacts the testing. So that question comes up a lot because many of our students have learning differences. Both ACT and SAT offer multiple accommodations. The most common that we see is extra time, an extra time accommodation. Both tests offer time and a half and double time, although it is more unusual to get a double time accommodation with SAT because the timing constraints are just not as severe as they are with the ACT. But in order to get accommodations on the testing, your child must have an active 504 or IEP plan in school, which typically requires either doctor's notes or, in most cases, a psychoed evaluation done by a psychologist within the last 3 years. So if it's done prior to 8th grade, then typically you would have to update any psychoed evaluation, even if your child has a 504 or an IEP. But if they do have one in place, your guidance counselor or the ESE coordinator at the high school will help you submit for College Board accommodations. And for ACT, your student actually has to be registered for a test first, and then the school can submit the documentation for an extra time accommodation. So what I often recommend to families is go ahead and get registered for a test, even if it's much earlier than you think your student will test, and go ahead and get the accommodation in place, because once it's in place, you don't lose it, and then you can always change your test date. But that way you know that the accommodation is there and you don't have to worry about it. For ACT, there is a little more flexibility in the accommodations because they do single day time and a half. They offer a multiple day time and a half. And then if a student gets double time, it's always offered over multiple days. So, you know, for students who have learning differences and may really have a hard time sitting for that long period of time, ACT might be a better option because of the flexibility of the testing and timing accommodations. So if that's something that would affect your particular child, I think we probably should have a conversation about the best way to approach that. Okay, another question. How much time should they spend outside of meeting with their tutor studying for the SAT or the ACT? Another great question that we hear a lot. So, I mean, I think parents ideally would like to see their students doing something every day. But what we have found is that's not realistic, particularly with high achievers who have multiple AP classes and are involved in extracurricular activities. So I have seen over the years that quality is probably more important than the quantity. And what that means is that we like to see them sitting down 2 to 3 times a week to do quality timed practice. That means at least a complete section. For SAT, they should probably sit down and try to do multiple reading sections, or a calculator and a no calculator section of math together. For an ACT, they should probably try to do at least an entire English or science or reading or math in one sitting, timed, to get the maximum benefit. And I always liken test prep to marathon training. So you're probably not going to run a marathon every weekend. That would be exhausting. So I'm not a huge fan of giving a full practice test every weekend, but you have to do some long runs. So once a week, they should be sitting down and probably doing about 2 to 2.5 hours of timed practice. So if they're taking an ACT, they might do 2 sections back to back. If they're doing an SAT, they should be doing all of the reading or all of the math. And that way, it allows us to get some scores and get an accurate representation of how the student is progressing, versus just checking homework that was probably done while they were laying on their bed, or maybe they were on their phone and chatting with their friends and not fully focused. And also, it allows them to start really developing some of that mental endurance that they need, because this is an endurance game for both ACT and SAT. These are, 3.5, 4-hour exams. And so your child needs to develop the mental endurance and stamina to be able to be just as successful on the last section of the test as they are on the first section. What if your student is in the process of prepping right now, is a high achiever, and is not getting the results that you are looking for? So a couple of things, because this really comes up a lot, and it seems to come up a lot this time of year. Students have perhaps just taken their first exam, or maybe they had taken 2 exams and they were expecting that they were going to go into this, and parents were expecting that they were going to go into this and they were going to be one and done, which, by the way, almost never happens. So that is a really sort of erroneous expectation. So some of it is just recalibrating expectations. The other is sitting down, and if your student is, working with tutors, really looking at what's going on. Is the homework being done? Is the practice there? And oftentimes when we see a student who wasn't as successful on their first 1 or 2 SATs or ACTs as they had hoped, it really has to do with the fact that they just weren't doing the time to practice. And that needs to be incorporated into the weekly routine. I can't tell you many times I'll look at scores and I'll see that the student had done all their homework. I mean, they thought they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, but they didn't do any drop-in practices. They weren't doing anything timed. And as a result, they really felt stressed and anxious, and that negatively impacted the performance. Once your student has taken 2, possibly 3 ACTs or SATs, if you're still not seeing the progress that you're hoping to, then I think it's time to talk about whether or not you should switch gears and try and prep and practice and take the alternate exam. Because sometimes it looks like a student is going to be a great fit for one exam, and for one reason or another, it's just not working, and they need to give the other exam a try. Now, Palm Beach County offers juniors the opportunity to take the SAT for free. It's actually coming up next week, March 6th. So for those of you who have juniors, I'm sure you're aware of it, but if you're not, all of the juniors are signed up. Even if they've been prepping for ACT, I would definitely recommend that they take that free SAT. There's certainly no harm in doing it, as there are very, very few, and I could probably count them on one hand, schools that actually require students to send an entire testing history. Stanford, UPenn, but for the most part, schools will allow you to pick and choose which scores you're going to send, so it doesn't hurt a student to take a free test that's being offered. So I would encourage them to do that. And sometimes a student who's been prepping for ACT gets their SAT score back, and we find that that actually is the better exam, and we switch gears. So I think, it's important to go into test prep with this mindset that it's a little bit like trying to catch a moving target. I mean, sometimes we have to make adjustments, sometimes changes need to be made, but this is really a marathon. It's not a sprint. Many, in fact, most students are taking between 4 and 6 exams. Sometimes it's all ACT or all SAT. Sometimes it is a combination of the 2. What should my student be doing over the summer to help them get ready? Well, if your child is in town, and if it looks like they will be testing either early in the fall or kind of middle of the year, they can start either meeting with a tutor individually to get some strategy, and they can start doing practice, even timed practice, to familiarize themselves with the test. I guess this is me maybe living with a junior right now and seeing how much they have on their plates. I've never been a huge advocate for prepping students, a year and a half before they're going to begin testing. I find that they burn out, and we really want them prepping when they are in the position to perform to their maximum potential. So if you have a kid who's going into Algebra 2 as a junior, starting to prep them very early the summer before, when they're going to be testing in the spring, is probably going to create some frustration and certainly fatigue. So I think, if you have a student who is going to be testing, the summer is a really great time to prepare, but only for those students who would be testing earlier. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware, but both ACT and SAT have added summer tests. So for juniors who are here during the summer, there is a July ACT, and that actually can be a very good test because, as I'm not sure if many of you are aware, standardized tests are always scored on a bell curve. So your student's score is not solely determined by their own performance. It is also based on the overall strength of the testing pool, the size of the testing pool. So what we found last year is, like the September ACT, the July ACT seemed to be a big pool of students who either were testing for the first time, juniors, so seniors are a full year older and have the benefit of more education under their belt and more preparation under their belt. It's also a bigger pool of students who are perhaps on the lower end of the bell curve who are working to get those scores up. So for students who are sort of the middle or the upper end of the bell curve, that July test can be a great test, and it's the same with the August SAT as well. So if you have juniors who are still maybe not exactly where they want to be and they're home for the summer, they should really consider taking those summer exams. And for very, very high achieving juniors who are going into calculus, those could be potential exams as well. Another question, how early should a student start prepping if you have a student who's a sophomore who will have completed Algebra 2 by the end of sophomore year? So as we were saying, that's a great question. That student would likely be testing in the fall or sort of winter time frame. So one of the things that we would want to look at for that student is the 10th grade PSAT. If the PSAT was extremely high, then that would potentially be a student who would start with SAT. And as we mentioned, SAT is really going up through Algebra 2. So at that point, a student with a high PSAT score who had completed Algebra 2 could begin prepping over the summer, could prep for the PSAT, which is in early October, and schedule an SAT either August or October, depending on how that student is progressing and how early in the summer he or she was able to start prepping. If it is a student whose PSAT score was perhaps average and that student had a competitive ACT baseline and we thought we were going to prep for the ACT, then that student would likely target an October or December ACT, probably December, and would likely start prepping middle to end of the summer or early into the school year, depending on what their schedule was. And we would look at factors, like I said, athletics, travel plans for the summer. But in both cases, whether it was SAT or ACT, we would probably want to use some of that summer downtime, get that student ready. One of the other questions that we hear a lot, and I think teachers tend to perpetuate this, is there a better month to take the ACT and SAT than others? So, yeah, yes, we definitely see over, we've seen over the last few years that there tend to be tests that are a little bit higher scoring. And this may not be a product so much of the test itself and the level of difficulty of the test. And that's where I think, I'll often have students come back and they'll say, my teacher said the June test is really hard. Well, I don't know that the June test is harder than the other tests. I think students are more fatigued in June because they've had AP exams and ACE exams and final exams, and they've probably already tested and they're exhausted. So the scores tend overall to not be as high. That said, as I was just mentioning, the summer tests seem to have been very competitive scoring tests, and that may be for a number of reasons. The pool of applicants that's testing, the fact that students have had some downtime and they're not as exhausted, that may contribute to higher scores. I mean, I often like to see my seniors taking that August SAT, if they've been taking SAT, or the September ACT. Those tend to be good scoring tests. The February tests seem to be pretty competitive, and again, it may be because that tends to be the beginning of the testing cycle and students are not as exhausted. So there's no real formula. I would not say that any particular test is harder. I think the thing that's important to remember, and this can be really, really frustrating for parents and students, College Board and ACT are businesses. They are looking to make a profit. And so they will sometimes make certain sections of the test more difficult because they want students to retest. So we saw this with the February test. Science scores across the board were a little bit lower, and that happens sometimes. And it's the beginning of a testing cycle, and it's not surprising. They want students to test again. So that is just the reality of kind of the world that we live in. And so it's really important to just stay positive, keep students focused, keep them working hard, and explain to them that is why there are so many test dates in a given year. And that is why most students test multiple times, and why a lot of schools and Bright Futures superscore, because they understand this. They also understand that a student might have a really great math day one day and a not so great math day 2 months later. So it's just important to keep it all in perspective. One other question that I wanted to address, because it does not necessarily apply to every student, but I do get a lot of questions about subject tests. So I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with SAT subject tests, but these are 1 hour content specific exams in a variety of subjects. So you have a couple of math subject tests, you have chemistry, physics, biology, US history, English. The vast majority of colleges do not require students to take subject tests, but there are some elite schools that require them, and still a few others that strongly recommend them. Subject tests are typically taken by the highest achievers. If you have a student who is extremely high achieving, who early on you suspect may have aspirations of attending an elite school, or at least wants to apply to some of the elite schools, it is a good idea for them to take subject tests if they're not strong. We don't have to send them, but we typically recommend that students take the vast majority of subject tests when they are taking AP exams, because the subject tests for the most part align with the AP classes, and College Board writes both the AP exams and the subject tests. So if students are studying for AP exams, they can take the appropriate subject test, align their efforts, hopefully kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So that means if you have a very high achiever who is taking world history in 10th grade and excelling in that class, you may want to consider having them take the subject test for world history at the end of sophomore year. The same would be AP biology. I know there are some sophomores who take that class. If you have a student who finishes pre-calculus in sophomore year, they could take the subject test, Math 2 subject test, which is pre-calculus, at the end of sophomore year. for the most part, this impacts juniors, and it really impacts only a very small population of students because, again, there are really only a handful of schools, Georgetown, some of the colleges within Cornell University, some majors at Penn, MIT. These are the caliber, the level of school that is going to require subject tests. But if that is something that is on your child's radar, on your radar, then we should plan and they should take subject tests in case they need to submit them. What is considered a strong subject test score? So this is a really important distinction because subject tests, since they are taken by only typically the highest achievers, the scores are sort of skewed, meaning it's still on a scale to 800 like the regular SAT, but if you have a math subject test score of 740, that may put your child only in the 70th percentile and would likely not be a competitive enough subject test score to send to an MIT or Georgetown. So typically when students are taking subject tests and they can retake them, we would be looking for scores that are going to put them, in the 90th or so percentile. And believe it or not, like on a math subject test, that could mean a 790. So that just gives you a little bit of a frame of reference there for what we might be looking for from subject tests and really sort of the caliber of student and aspirationally speaking that is going to be taking subject tests. What about the optional essay? So for both ACT and SAT, the essay portion is optional. None of the Florida schools require the essay. So if your child is going to be applying to Florida schools, and that includes, by the way, the private schools within Florida, University of Miami, Stetson, Eckerd, none of these schools require the essay. And the vast majority of schools outside of Florida also do not require the essay, with the exception of a few elite schools, the UCs in California, a few of the Cal states still require the essay, but each year the number of schools that requires the essay is diminishing. So if you have a student who you think will be applying to maybe one of the few schools I just mentioned now, they should plan on taking the essay probably once. It doesn't necessarily have to be the first time they test if they're going to be likely testing again, maybe the second time. And they should do a little bit of preparation for it. But even those schools that require the essay are not really looking at it as closely as they are the other sections of the test. So I would not necessarily have a student prepare to the same extent that they would the other sections of the test, but it's just something to be aware of. All right, so otherwise, I'm going to say goodnight and invite you, if you have questions regarding your child specifically, to please give us a call in the office. We're happy to help put you in touch with the appropriate advisor who can give you some specific direction. All right, thank you for joining me. Good night.